Well, the topic of this podcast is necessity and contingency. Although, in truth, it will lead to Proposition 47 again, although I haven't included it in the notes. There are notes attached to this podcast in the form of a PDF. It would have been too much to produce all the slides. Anyway, so necessity and contingency, but as with most of part 2 is really just a build up to Proposition 47. So I start in part 1, and the whole driver for Spinoza is the whole notion of cause and effect and of necessity. Given a given circumstance, or ground as they would call it in philosophy, given a set of circumstances, then the same thing will happen every time, which is why Spinoza says we have no free will. Put you in a situation with the knowledge you had at a particular time and the environment the same as that particular time, and you will do exactly the same thing again. It's kind of obvious, yet people don't see it. So necessity and contingency. Necessity is just right at the heart of what Spinoza is talking about all the way through part 1, part 2, part 3, and part 5 to some extent. Less so in part 4, but we start in part 1 with definition 7, and he says that thing is said to be free which exists solely from the necessity of its own nature. Now, there's some very fine points here. What Spinoza is saying, and he's talking about God obviously, is that God has a particular nature. It may be infinite, and he's saying that the essence of God, the thing that defines God, is existence. Once you've defined that, then you can postulate and think of infinite kinds of existence, which Spinoza does through the attributes. If you haven't listened to previous podcasts about part 1, then maybe you should do. Anyway, so the whole thing of necessity is right at the heart of the idea of God, because while God is infinite and eternal and is a free cause, the way that God manifests is not free. He, she, it manifests from the necessity of its own nature. And I can't remember where it is, but I'll dig it out because this will be a podcast at some point on Spinoza about what he means by God. And at some point he makes a comment that to understand God, what you really need to understand is the laws and the nature of existence. So, there's no idea here of some spirit or being or whatever that has some kind of volition and says, I want a universe there and a galaxy here, and I'll have some, six-legged, three-brained creatures down there. None of that. It's just all an unfolding from the necessity of its own nature. And there are very strong arguments for suggesting, as Schopenhauer does, that actually most of the universe is wholly unconscious. And that's another little rabbit hole. But so that thing is said to be free, which exists solely from the necessity of its own nature and is determined to action by itself alone. That doesn't define you or I. We are driven to action by external things in the main. The need for food, the need for warmth, whatever it is. A thing is said to be necessary, or rather constrained. Look how he uses the words, or puts an equivalence on the words necessary and constrained. The thing is said to be necessary, or rather constrained, if it is determined by another thing to exist and to act in a definite and determinate way. So for Spinoza, there is no contingency anywhere, not even with God. The whole damn thing is just a massive unfolding, a massive expression. I did the podcast on expressionism a few podcasts ago. It's just this unfolding expression. And our consciousness that we kind of arrogantly believe must be the way that the universe is conscious. We kind of think that our consciousness gives us, how can I put it, a foothold on reality, whereas our consciousness is just it's a local creation for us, or not for us, but it's a local creation that's come out of this unfolding. Our consciousness is just very particular to us. I'm sure a bat thinks its consciousness is how the world really is, or an ant. But I'm getting sidetracked. But this is, he uses these words again, definite and determinate. There's no room for any movement. It all ties in together. When Spinoza talks about we are slaves of nature or slaves of God, this is exactly what he's talking about. There is not a single vibration of an atom in your body that is not determined, let alone the thoughts going on in your head. And if there's somebody on this planet who manifests truly diabolical qualities, then that is an expression of God, a necessary expression. And similarly, if someone is saintly, like a Buddha or Jesus Christ, then that is a necessary manifestation of God as well. This is how the whole thing unwinds. And for me, all that is quite refreshing, because it just puts the whole thing into the notion of this huge thing called creation, or whatever you want to call it, just unfolding in the only way that it can unfold. So proposition 29 in part 1, he says, nothing in nature is contingent, but all things are, from the necessity of the divine nature, determined to exist and act in a definite way. There are massive implications of all of this, and he unfolds them in part 1, particularly the appendix in part 1. And part 2 and part 3 and part 4. So, once you, for example, have defined the essence of man to be the conatus, then you unfold all the properties like envy and jealousy and love and hatred and pride and so on. It's just a mechanical thing working out. And then we get to proposition 44 in part 2, which is, in a sense, the core proposition for this particular podcast. Although I move on to 45 and 46, because all roads lead to Rome in this podcast, or in the podcast series at the moment. And Rome is proposition 47 in part 2, and all of this leads to proposition 47 in part 2. So he says, proposition 44 part 2, he says, it is not in the nature of reason to regard things as contingent, but as necessary. And I'll read the proof. It is in the nature of reason to perceive things truly, to wit, as they are in themselves. That is, not as contingent, but as necessary. This is an important shift of focus in the way we think about things. Because most of us, quite unconsciously very often, are thinking in terms of, well, could have, should have, would have. If only I'd taken that job there, and if only I had not met this person, or whatever. For Spinoza, everything that happens, good or bad, as far as we judge it, is absolutely necessary. And so reason would only consider necessity. And contingency is simply a fact, simply a creation of imagination. So in the corollary, he says, the first corollary, he says, hence it follows that it solely results from imagination that we regard things both in respect of the past and of the future as contingent. Now, as I mentioned before, we can indulge imagination consciously, but the problem is that most of the time we do it unconsciously. So we might be thinking about, I don't know, meeting somebody for lunch. We start having imaginations about what might come from the conversation. If it's a business meeting, then the outcomes that might come from that. If it's a romantic liaison, what might come from that, and so on. And we start doing that. And of course, the fact that we're doing that is also necessary. As Spinoza says many times in part 4, our inadequate behaviour is just as necessary as our adequate behaviour. There's never any room in Spinoza anywhere, he's got all the angles covered, there's no room anywhere for self-judgment or criticism. All that he's asking us to do is to understand. And whether you understand or not will be a necessary manifestation. But of course, by reading Spinoza, you know, the whatever you want to call it, the act of grace or whatever that brought me to Spinoza and to other people that have changed my inner world, then that was necessary as well. So we are slaves of God, truly slaves of God, as Spinoza says. So I'll read that again. Hence it follows that it solely results from imagination that we regard things both in respect of the past and of the future as contingent. Now, the next corollary is not kind of obvious, but I'll try and explain it as best I can. It is in the nature of reason to perceive things in the light of eternity. Necessity is a manifestation of eternity, as far as Spinoza is concerned, because God manifests necessarily, or the universe. So I read the proof. It is in the nature of reason to regard things as necessary, not as contingent. Now it perceives this necessity truly, that is, as it is in itself. This thing of perceiving things as they are in themselves, very Zen, very Buddhist, very Taoist. You know, focus on reality rather than what could have been, should have been, or whatever. So, it is in the nature of reason to regard things as necessary, not as contingent. Now it perceives this necessity truly, that is, as it is in itself. But this necessity is the very necessity of God's eternal nature. So what I've just been saying, God's eternal nature is to manifest necessarily, and all that you see around you is this flowering, this unfolding, this expression of the universe, God, nature, whatever you want to call it. Therefore, it is in the nature of reason to regard things in this light of eternity. Furthermore, the basic principles of reason are those notions which explicate what is common to all things. You can see how involved all this is. We're talking about the common notions now. What is common to all things we perceive adequately. Necessity is one of the things for Spinoza that is common to all things, as well as existence. So, I'll read that again. Furthermore, the basic principles of reason are those notions which explicate what is common to all things, and do not explicate the essence of any particular thing, and therefore must be conceived without any relation to time, but in the light of eternity. What Spinoza is saying is that necessity, existence, those are two of the things that he's mentioned, in our discussion so far, are eternal. And so when we consider necessity, when we see the universe unfolding as a necessary unfolding, We are watching eternity in action, so to speak. Quite beautiful, actually. It's always the same with this. You at some point you're going to have to study this yourself and pull out more bits from it. Because, as you can probably see, this can go on forever. I could spend 4 or 5 podcasts on Proposition 44. And I haven't got all of it there. That's just an extract from it. So we then get to Proposition 45, and this is where we get back to one of the main roads to Rome, i.e. Proposition 47. Every idea of any body or particular thing existing in actuality necessarily involves the eternal and infinite essence of God. He's laying it out here. If anybody's seen anybody else talk about this, well, I know one other person who's seen this, and that's Gary Sugar, although he keeps it fairly close to his chest. But if you've seen any of the academics who've understood what's being talked about here, then please let me know, because they all seem to miss this, and I think the reason they miss it is because the G word is very, very difficult for academics these days. It's politically incorrect to use the G word. God, of course. And I have emails regularly from students at universities saying, oh, please can you do more on Spinoza, because they don't teach it in the course that we have. And in fact, my sister works at a university that has a large philosophy department, and they don't teach Spinoza. Very, very unfashionable. Anyway, 45. Every idea of any body or particular thing existing in actuality necessarily involves the eternal and infinite essence of God. Well, of course it does, because if it's existing, then it involves existence. The idea of a particular thing actually existing necessarily involves both the essence and the existence of the thing. But particular things cannot be conceived without God. Now, since they have God for their cause, insofar as he is considered under that attribute of which the things themselves are modes, their ideas must necessarily involve the conception of their attribute, that is, the eternal and infinite essence of God. I don't know why Spinoza made all this so circular and so difficult to pull the juice out of. Maybe he just couldn't say it straight out in the days that he was publishing. I mean, he was almost murdered anyway for what he said. Then the scholium. Here, by existence, I do not mean duration, that is, existence insofar as it is considered in the abstract as a kind of quantity. I am speaking of the very nature of existence. We have to go back to part 1 to sort of unwind that, but God by definition is that whose essence involves existence. So if it involves existence, then it means it continually exists, which means it involves eternity. Here by existence I do not mean duration, that is, existence insofar as it is considered in the abstract as a kind of quantity. I am speaking of the very nature of existence, which is attributed to particular things because they follow in infinite numbers in infinite ways from the eternal necessity of God's nature. I am speaking, I repeat, of the very existence of particular things insofar as they are in God. For although each particular thing is determined by another particular thing to exist in a certain manner, the force by which each perseveres in existing follows from the eternal necessity of God's nature. And then Proposition 46, which is really quite beautiful and just ties the whole thing up really. The knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God, which each idea involves, is adequate and perfect. So, the proof. The proof of the preceding proposition is universally valid, and whether a thing be considered as a part or a whole, its idea, whether of whole or part, involves the eternal and infinite essence of God. This is the common notions idea. A common notion is something that is equally in the part as in the whole. Well, necessity is equally in the part as in the whole, as is existence. Therefore, that which gives knowledge of the eternal and infinite essence of God is common to all things, and equally in the part as the whole, and so this knowledge will be adequate. It's a big deal. Adequate knowledge is a big deal. Coming to be in reality, to live with what is, to use reason. Reason only sees what is, doesn't see could be, should be, would have, could have, and so on. Equally, we only see existence as it is, reality. There's nothing hidden. There's nothing to go searching for. The whole of it is, if you'll excuse the phrase, sat on your face. It's just that we're lost in imagination and ideas about things that don't necessarily take us any close to the things. To see the absolute necessity of manifestation second by second is to be in reality. Anyway, a couple more podcasts on part 2 and then we'll be done with it and we'll drop down to part 1. And then round about April, I guess, we'll be storming into part 5. There's something very important here that I've just remembered. And so this is an addendum to the original podcast. It'll only take a few minutes. What we need to be able to do is to stand naked in the face of reality and existence. Now that requires a whole pile of courage, because we will feel naked without our favourite belief systems, without our favourite emotional responses, without our favourite biases and whatever else and habits, just to stand naked in the face of existence. It's a very hard thing to do, to live in reality with what is here, now, not what could have been or should have been. To be dealing with our own inner state here now as it is manifesting is a very difficult thing to do, and very few people achieve that, because there's always some prop somewhere. To be in reality is to be in God. That's the ultimate situation. But to be in reality, because reality is God, or nature, or whatever term you want to use. Anyway, that was an important point, and even though I'd finished the podcast, I thought that was worth adding.